Have you ever wondered why, after your spiritual awakening, the fire you once had suddenly disappeared? Why the motivation you thought would push you forward feels like it's been taken away? Don't be afraid. This is not the end of your journey. It's the beginning of a deeper one. Sometimes when God awakens your spirit, He removes the very drive you once relied on. Not because He wants to punish you, but because He's teaching you something far greater. He's pulling you out of the shallow waters of worldly ambition and into the ocean of His purpose. In this message, we'll uncover why your motivation fades after awakening, and how this is actually a divine sign that God is preparing you for the next chapter of your destiny. When people go through what we often call a spiritual awakening, they tend to expect an endless surge of energy, a constant feeling of being driven, inspired, and unstoppable. It's as if they believe awakening will permanently light a fire inside of them that never dies out. But in reality, for many, the opposite happens. The drive, the worldly motivation, the ambition that once carried them forward suddenly fades away. It feels as though the fire goes out. And this can be deeply confusing, even frightening, because we mistake that fading of energy for failure, or worse, for abandonment. But in truth, there's something much more profound happening. When God strips away that old form of motivation, it is not a mistake, it is intentional. You see, most of the drive that fuels us before awakening is built on the wrong foundation. It's built on comparison, on competition, on the endless pursuit of recognition or success. Our identity becomes attached to the very things that can be taken away at any moment: our career, our social standing, our possessions, even the praise of others. And so when you awaken spiritually, one of the first things God does is dismantle that fragile foundation. He removes the dependence on temporary ambitions so that you can begin to build a new kind of drive, one that doesn't collapse the moment external circumstances change. Psychologically speaking, this is an identity shift. For most of our lives, our sense of meaning is externalized. We strive for the approval of parents, teachers, peers, society at large. That pursuit can be powerful. It gets us out of bed in the morning. It drives us to succeed. But it's also shallow. The moment those voices stop applauding, or the moment the reward system breaks down, the entire structure collapses. And if your awakening has pulled that away, it's because you're being prepared for something that doesn't rest on applause at all. You're being moved into a way of living where your worth and your energy come from something eternal, not something fleeting. This process is uncomfortable precisely because it strips you of what you thought made you strong. You wake up one day and realize that the things that used to excite you, that used to give you direction, no longer do. And so you feel lost, disoriented, even anxious. But that very disorientation is part of the transformation. Think of it as detox. If someone has lived on junk food their entire life, their taste buds become trained to crave it. But when they begin to eat real, nourishing food, there is an initial resistance. The old cravings are gone, but the new taste hasn't fully developed. Spiritually, this is exactly what happens. The junk motivation has been taken away, but the deeper, richer drive hasn't fully formed yet. Philosophically, this is an encounter with the nature of truth itself. What you once thought mattered, status, money, being admired, was never truly stable. You are forced to confront the reality that life built on those things eventually collapses. Awakening is the recognition that the ground beneath your feet was never solid to begin with. And once you see that, God does not allow you to go back and live with illusions. He takes away the drive to keep pursuing those shallow goals, precisely so you can develop a hunger for what actually endures. This is also where faith enters. Because in that void, when your old motivation is gone and the new one hasn't yet revealed itself, you are called to trust. Trust not in your own strength, but in God's. And that's the point. The removal of motivation is meant to teach dependence. It is designed to reorient your heart away from yourself and toward Him. If your drive came only from within your limited willpower, you would eventually collapse. But if your drive flows from a source outside of you, from God Himself, then it cannot be shaken by circumstance, disappointment, or failure. So the next time you find yourself wondering why your fire has gone out after awakening, remember this: it hasn't gone out at all. It has been deliberately extinguished in one form so that it can be reignited in another. The false fuel is gone. And what feels like emptiness is actually preparation. It is God clearing away the clutter of shallow ambition to make room for something infinitely more stable, more enduring, more life-giving. And the question for you is this: will you sit in the silence long enough to let that new fire ignite? Because if you can endure the emptiness without running back to the old illusions, you will discover a motivation that no circumstance can take away and no loss can destroy. The death of your old drive is not the end of your purpose. It is the beginning of a higher one. When motivation begins to fade after awakening, the first instinct most people have is to think that something has gone wrong. They assume they've lost their way or that they've somehow failed God. But that's a misinterpretation. What looks like punishment is often a test, and the difference between the two is crucial. Punishment is designed to condemn, a test is designed to strengthen. If you don't grasp that distinction, you'll misread the entire experience and sink into despair rather than growth. What happens when God takes away the drive you once relied on is that He forces you into a confrontation with faith itself. Because let's be honest, when you're motivated, it's easy to keep moving. You don't even have to think about it. The current of energy carries you along. But when that current disappears, suddenly it's no longer about how you feel. It's about what you believe. It's about whether you'll keep walking when there's no applause, no inspiration, and no emotional high to carry you. Psychologically, this moment is critical. Most of us are conditioned to depend on emotion to determine our direction. If we feel excited, we assume we're on the right path. If we feel drained, we assume something is wrong. That's an incredibly dangerous way to live, because feelings are unstable. They shift with mood, with circumstance, even with something as trivial as whether you slept well last night. And if your entire sense of meaning and direction is chained to that instability, then your life will mirror it up one day, down the next, never secure. So when God removes motivation, it is, in a sense, the removal of your crutch. You are no longer allowed to lean on the fragile support of your emotions. Instead, you're being asked to walk with the strength of conviction. This is why it feels like a test, because it is. It's a refining fire that separates genuine faith from shallow enthusiasm. Think about how this works in any discipline. A student preparing for a major exam might have started with the excitement of learning something new. But by the time the test comes, the excitement is gone. What matters then is not the initial burst of energy, but the discipline of having studied consistently. The test exposes whether you've built real knowledge or whether you were simply caught up in a temporary mood. Spiritually, it's the same thing. When motivation is gone, the test reveals whether your faith is real or just emotional momentum. Philosophically, this connects to one of the deepest questions about human existence. What does it mean to act rightly when there is no reward? Anyone can behave morally or pursue purpose when the outcome is obvious and the incentives are immediate. But that the true measure of character is whether you continue to do the right thing when there is no visible payoff, when the silence seems deafening, and when God himself feels hidden. In that silence, something profound is being shaped in you, the ability to live by principle rather than by impulse. And it's worth noticing that some of the greatest figures in history, both religious and secular, have gone through this exact process. People who accomplished meaningful things rarely did so on a wave of constant excitement. They did it by persevering through the absence of motivation, by showing up when it was hardest to show up, by walking forward even when it felt like nothing was happening. That perseverance is what gave their work depth. The same principle applies here when God takes away the drive you relied on. He's giving you the chance to build perseverance rooted in something far stronger than fleeting emotion. It's in this space that you learn the difference between faith and comfort. Faith, by its very definition, exists in the absence of certainty. If you could see the outcome, if you could always feel the energy, it wouldn't require trust at all. Faith only exists in the gap between what you feel and what you believe. And this is why so many people misread the test. They expect faith to feel like comfort. But it doesn't. It feels like risk. It feels like stepping forward into the dark, hoping there will be ground to stand on. But that's precisely the point. Because once you experience that the ground does appear, even when you can't see it ahead of time, you become unshakable. You no longer live dependent on the highs and lows of motivation. You live anchored in something deeper. Conviction, principle, faith. And that is exactly what God is cultivating when He removes your old drive. So when you find yourself in that season where nothing seems to move you, when the inspiration is gone and the silence feels unbearable, recognize it for what it is. You are not being punished, you are being tested. And that test is designed to forge strength you cannot develop in any other way. The absence of motivation is not the absence of God. It is His invitation to walk by faith, not by sight. One of the hardest things to accept about spiritual growth is that it's not simply an addition process. It's not just about stacking more purpose, more clarity, more joy on top of what you already had. Growth, especially when it's directed by God, almost always begins with subtraction. Things have to be removed. And sometimes the first thing He removes is the very drive that once pushed you forward. At first glance, that feels like loss. You wake up one day and realize the old passions don't ignite you anymore. The goals you used to chase don't make sense. And the routines that once carried you now feel hollow. It can seem like you've been abandoned by your own purpose. But what's really happening is a kind of clearing, an intentional emptying of what no longer serves your destiny, so there's space for what does. Psychologically, this mirrors what happens in the process of transformation. In Jungian terms, the old self has to die so the new self can emerge. You can't drag your former identity into your future without paying a heavy price. If you cling to it, it will choke out your growth. And so God, in His wisdom, often does for us what we refuse to do for ourselves. He strips away the attachments that keep us bound to the lesser version of who we are. This is why losing motivation after awakening is not a sign of regression. It's a signal of redirection. The drive you once had may have been enough for a previous stage of your life, but it's inadequate for the level you're being called into. Imagine trying to power a modern city with the same technology that once lit a single lamp. It won't work. You need a completely different source of energy. In the same way, God is preparing you for a different level of responsibility, influence, or insight. The old motivations are simply too small for the new life He's building. Philosophically, this is a confrontation with the idea of meaning itself. Viktor Frankl once observed that human beings can endure almost anyhow if they have a sufficient why. But the truth is, our why cannot remain static. What gave your life meaning at 20 is not the same as what must sustain you at 40. If your meaning doesn't evolve, it withers. God then removes the stale motivations so that you are forced to seek out a deeper why, one that can sustain you across the seasons of your life. It's also important to recognize that this clearing is not random. It is highly specific. God doesn't just strip away at random. He dismantles with purpose. The ambitions that collapse after awakening are usually the ones tied to ego, vanity, or fear. They are the false scaffolds propping up your identity, and when they come down, it feels destabilizing because you realize you've been leaning against something fragile all along. But here's the paradox that destabilization is the very thing that makes room for authenticity. You can't construct a house on rotten wood. It has to be cleared before anything durable can be built. In practical terms, this means that if you find yourself in a season where nothing excites you the way it used to, don't panic. Pay attention. That emptiness is pointing you toward a new direction. It's an invitation to reflect on what truly matters, to identify what desires are rooted in shallow ambition and what desires are connected to a higher calling. It's uncomfortable, yes, but discomfort is often the birthplace of clarity. Think of it like pruning. A gardener doesn't cut away branches because the tree is failing. He cuts them because the tree is preparing to grow. The removal looks harsh, but the purpose is expansion. And in the same way, when God clears out old motivations, He's not destroying your potential. He's protecting it. He's ensuring that your energy, your passion, and your life force are not wasted on things too small for you, but are redirected toward things worthy of you. The real challenge here is patience, because in the space between the old motivations dying and the new ones emerging, there is silence. And silence is uncomfortable. Most people rush to fill it with distractions, forcing themselves back into old habits just to avoid the feeling of emptiness. But if you can resist that urge, if you can stay in that silence long enough, you will discover that the clearing was not emptiness at all. It was preparation. And that brings us to the central truth of this point. Sometimes God takes away your old fire not to punish you, but to plant a new one. The absence is not a void, it's soil. And the seeds being planted there will, in time, grow into a purpose far larger and stronger than anything you had before. When God removes your motivation, it is not subtraction, it is preparation for a destiny that requires more space than your old life could hold. One of the great misunderstandings about life with God is the assumption that our value is measured by what we do, how productive we are, how much we achieve. how consistently we move forward. This mindset is so deeply ingrained in us that when the drive to keep producing suddenly disappears, we interpret it as failure. But what if it's not failure at all? What if it's a recalibration? Sometimes the reason God removes your motivation is to teach you a lesson our culture has almost entirely forgotten. Your worth is not tied to your performance, but to your presence with Him. From a psychological perspective, we live in a world obsessed with output. Productivity becomes a kind of moral currency. If you're busy, you're valuable. If you're exhausted, you must be important. And so when motivation collapses, it feels like identity collapses with it. We mistake stillness for weakness and rest for laziness. But that perspective is not only destructive, it's false. It fails to account for the reality that human beings are not machines. We are not designed for endless output. We are designed for rhythm, work and rest, movement and stillness, doing and being. Philosophically, this points to a profound paradox. The deepest truths about life are not discovered in constant motion, but in moments of quiet. Think about it, most of the great breakthroughs in philosophy, psychology, even science, didn't happen in frantic activity. They emerged from stillness, from reflection, from space that allowed new insight to appear. When you are constantly chasing the next thing, your vision narrows. You're focused only on immediate goals, but when the drive is taken away, when you're forced to sit in stillness, your perspective expands. You begin to notice things you were blind to before. Spiritually, this is even more significant. The scriptures are filled with moments where God does His deepest work not in the rush of activity, but in the silence of waiting. Elijah heard God not in the earthquake or the fire, but in the still small voice. Christ Himself withdrew from the crowds again and again to find solitude with the Father. These are not accidents. They are patterns. And if God removes your motivation, it may be His way of calling you into the same pattern, away from endless striving into rest, into His presence. Now, rest here doesn't mean passivity. It doesn't mean you abandon responsibility or retreat into apathy. It means you learn to separate your identity from your output. It means you rediscover that your existence in and of itself has value, and from that place of rootedness, your actions become more meaningful. Ironically, when you no longer feel pressured to prove your worth through performance, you begin to produce work that is more authentic, more powerful, and more aligned with your purpose. This is where psychological well-being and spiritual wisdom converge. Burnout, depression, and existential exhaustion often come from chasing endless productivity without pausing to rest. Our nervous systems are not built for perpetual striving. They demand restoration. And God, knowing this, sometimes intervenes by removing the very drive that would otherwise push you past your breaking point. He forces you to stop, not to hinder you, but to save you. If you think carefully about it, the times when you felt most empty were often the very moments that led to your greatest clarity. The stillness stripped away the noise. The silence forced you to confront questions you had been avoiding. And the lack of motivation gave you space to reevaluate why you were doing what you were doing in the first place. That's not failure, that's wisdom being planted in you. But again, the real challenge is enduring the discomfort of stillness. Most people can't bear it. They rush to fill the silence with distraction, technology, entertainment, anything to drown out the discomfort of simply being. And yet, if you can resist that impulse, if you can sit in the quiet and allow yourself to be present with God, you will discover that stillness is not emptiness. It is fullness. It is the place where you hear the voice that cannot be heard above the noise. So when your motivation vanishes and you feel paralyzed by inactivity, don't rush to condemn yourself. Don't assume that God has abandoned you. Consider the possibility that He has drawn you into rest, into His presence, so that you can discover a truth that constant striving can never reveal. That your value is not in what you produce, but in who you are when you are still before Him. Sometimes God removes your drive not to stop your progress, but to remind you that the greatest progress is found in His presence.